Hello and welcome to the video. This is a video and update and some flying and setup footage on this Walksnail GM3 gimbal that I've got here. I've had quite a few questions from people, so I thought it was worthwhile making a video to kind of cover how it all works, how you put it together, what it is, and also what it isn't. Now, I've been looking forward to getting into head tracking with HD FPV for quite some time. I've played with head tracking in the past with simple pan and tilt setups. I've actually designed a few and put them on Thingiverse as well. So if you're using one of those, thank you for downloading my designs. But what I really wanted was the ability to look around in HD. And there have been a couple of gimbals that have come through. Remember that one that I put on a radio controlled car? But this is a really cute, elegant idea by Walksnail, which means that a lot of the messing around with setting up trainer ports and forwarding channels is just taken away from you. Now, the ability to use these gimbals as a head tracker is already built into the Goggles L, as you can see, and it also is available as the Goggles X. You can put an extra little module on the top and that adds that capability. The Goggles X has a 6 degrees of freedom gyro and accelerometer inside. However, they've made an improved one that goes outside. Not particularly elegant, but I am getting one of those units in and I'll show how that all works too. A couple of things about the gimbals though. The actual gimbals themselves are not a Walksnail designed product. The firmware is, from what I understand. These actually look like the Hyohan stabilization gimbals, and that explains the slightly odd single and dual axis options for HT use. For a single axis, most of us would probably have gone for a pan option, looking side to side. For a 2-axis option, most of us would have gone with a pan and tilt setup for head tracking. However, these look like they've been designed for more stabilization purposes when you're flying around, and it looks like Walksnail have taken these gimbals and added their own firmware on it and a way to connect it directly to the avatar units. Now, in the goggles themselves, there are 2 ways to set up head tracking. The first is you can output a PPM signal from the port at the bottom, plug it into your radio, and you can use it just like any head tracker from your Fat Shark goggles or whatever else, and you can send and forward those channels up to the model. And I've actually shown that when I originally got the Goggles L. However, the far more sophisticated way of doing it is by setting up something called PTZ in the head tracker menu in the goggles. That then sends the signal from the goggles directly to the gimbal via the avatar unit without you having to do anything apart from plug the gimbal into the avatar unit, and it's all done for you. Now, the gimbals do need the mini port on the side, as you can see here, for the avatar to plug into if you're going to use this really cool PTZ way of doing it that I'm using here. So the gimbal can't be used with the version 1 VTXs, the Mini 1Ss, the Nano 3s and the GT VTX. It has to have that port on the side. So what you need is a V2 VTX, a VT VTX Dual, or something like the Moonlight VTXs with that kind of smaller port, and it just plugs in. You will need the latest firmware on the avatar unit and your goggles. I think there is also a firmware update available for the actual gimbal itself. To set it up, you just plug the gimbal into the avatar unit using the supplied cable, then you bind to it as normal using the goggles, and then it'll just burst into life. Just make sure that it's set for PTZ in the head tracker menu, and boom, you're in business. Now, there are a couple of settings in terms of stabilization. I'll talk about those in a minute. To recenter on the Goggles L, you just press the middle button 3 times. That will recenter everything. I would recommend letting the goggles warm up before you do this stuff, as there can potentially be a little bit of drift due to temperature changes inside the goggles with both the gyro and accelerometer. So let's cut to the chase. What is it actually like to fly with this head tracking system from Walksnail, and what are the good and bad points about it? Well, we've been flying it long enough here that I think I can actually give a reasonably objective view on this. I'd fly this with a very well-tuned model, making sure that ideally you have something like a flight controller or stabilizer in it that can do a little bit of the heavy lifting to keep things straight and level and give you a little bit of assistance, so when you take your hands off the sticks, the plane flies itself. Now, the reason for that is that when you're looking around, it can be a little bit disorientating, particularly in the early stages. And using something like auto launch or launching line of sight and then pulling the goggles down is the way that we've been playing with it here. Trying to launch with the stabilization, which is the minimum amount available in the current firmware that I'm playing with here, means that as you lift the plane up, all it means is the nose comes into view. Now that's not a big disaster, but it means that you do need a little bit of help getting the plane into the air. Once the plane is flying straight and level, you can always just hit that button on the side of the goggles, reset it for straight and level, and then you can start looking around. In use, there is very little lag and it feels very natural. The movement is very much in line with the goggles, and that little bit of stabilization and smoothing that the gimbal's still doing doesn't kind of get in the way. There's no real drift that we've noticed, particularly if you let the goggles warm up before you start playing with everything. Although I would recommend going through the process to calibrate the accelerometer, the gyro, and also the magnetometer. That's available in the menu. We found that the best experience was using it when something or someone else was actually flying the model. For example, my friend had a go where I was actually flying the plane line of sight and he put the goggles on and he was looking around, and that was really natural and very good fun. But again, you could do that if iNav was maybe flying a mission. You could use the goggles then to look around, and you can actually turn quite a way back, looking out down over the wing, and as you're turning, looking into the ground. It becomes quite natural, but one thing you have to be a little bit careful of is you might not realize how much you naturally move your head if you've been flying FPV for a long time. Of course, any movement in the goggles is going to move the gimbal. So you do have to focus in the first couple of flights, keeping your head still unless you actively want to look away from the direction that you're flying. The other thing that we've noticed is you will have to keep a much closer eye on the on-screen display, particularly about things like the height. Now, for FPV pilots in fixed wing and quads, we tend to use where the horizon is in the picture to give us a good idea of whether we're gaining or losing height, even if we're not actively watching the height in things like an on-screen display. However, with things like the little bit of stabilization and the head tracking stuff turned on here, it's very easy to actually have the plane in a slightly nose up or slightly nose down attitude without really realizing it, and then noticing that, oh, actually I'm getting quite high, or oh, blimey, the trees are getting a little bit big. So get used to keeping a much closer eye on your instruments to make sure that you aren't accidentally getting towards the legal ceiling or getting a bit too close to the ground. I personally wish there was an option to disable the head tracking piece and only turn it on when you want to. And again, maybe that's a future firmware thing that they'll give us, because right now, as soon as the goggle is connected, the head tracking system is live, and by triple pressing the button on the side, it resets what straight and level is, and it uses that as the reference. It would have been nice if there was a button to be able to turn that on and off for maybe takeoff and landings and those kind of things where it's a more traditional setup. I personally would have found that very useful. Coming into land in head tracker mode can be a little bit tricky. You've really got to keep your head very still and not move around, but also that little bit of drift there is, particularly in the single axis, even when you've got most of the stabilization turned off, can be a little bit distracting, because you kind of do want to see exactly which part of the field you're aiming for and where you're eventually going to hit the grass. And the final thing is, if you are one of those people that gets a little bit travel sick, and I do if I'm not driving the vehicle or sat in the passenger seat at the front, just be a little bit careful with this. I haven't had any kind of woozy feelings in a head tracker or a FPV situation for a long time, but this, if you were flying it for a long time, I think you could absolutely, if you were prone to that, start to feel a little bit woozy, because you're potentially looking at things and your inner ear and what you're actually seeing with your eyes are going to be very, very different. And that's something that I don't suffer with normal fixed FPV, but after flying the head tracker for a little while, it does start to get a little bit ropey. So I would personally recommend set up something like iNav or AutoPilot, have it flying in a mode where it's going to manage its own height, get used to keeping your head still, watch the on-screen display, and personally I would still land it line of sight, or get used to keeping everything locked absolutely straight and forward and almost do like an instrument-only landing. So I hope that's been useful for those of you that have been interested in this. This is one of those things that I've personally been really looking forward to for a long time, being able to have really reactive, responsive head tracking that's super smooth with the Walksnail system. As I said at the beginning, I think these gimbals are actually something that Walksnail has taken on and tweaked with firmware. Hopefully the firmware is going to improve over the next couple of revisions. I would like the ability to turn head tracking on and off in the goggles, and I would also like the ability to have no stabilization in the gimbal as well, so that it's locked straight and forward. So even as I roll and pitch around in the plane, that nose isn't creeping into view. And that's my last bit really. I'd recommend not putting a gimbal right at the front of the model. Being able to see a little bit of the vehicle within the image really helps you see when you're not quite looking where you're going. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Pedantry 60 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.